A quiet town shattered, and more than just a grocery store was left in ruin. Ethan Blair Miller was a lonely incel and fantasist with many red flags. But with his online rants and destructive behavior often hidden from the public, was this tragedy inevitable, and could it have been stopped? As investigators sifted through his digital footprint, many chilling details emerged, alongside a manifesto that gained more than 400,000 views online, one that can barely be found to this very day. So, how does a troubled mind like Ethan's turn into a killer? What were the romantic fantasies left behind in his journal? And what can we learn from this nonsense? 21-year-old Ethan Miller had some pretty terrible plans. Now, thankfully, his lack of patience or his overabundance of rage would eventually get the better of him. Now, this could have ended much, much worse. Not to say that there were no casualties, but, well, actually, I think you should just watch the video instead. Before we begin, here is a quick reminder that if you do like these sorts of stories, then maybe consider subscribing. It really does help the channel out. Not only that, but you'll see what's in store over the coming weeks. But anyway, for now, let's begin. Please, grab yourself a coffee. This is the case of Ethan Miller. It was on the evening of August 28, 2022 that the residents of Bend in Oregon became privy to some rather concerning news. As some of you will know, Bend is a lively city celebrated for its breathtaking landscapes, abundant outdoor activities, and of course, its thriving craft beer scene. Renowned for its numerous breweries, restaurants, and culture, it is no wonder that Bend sees a lot of tourists. And with an average of more than 300 sunny days per year, I would likely be one of them. By the way, who here remembers Blockbuster? And did you know that Bend has the last remaining store in the entire country? With nostalgia and happy faces all year round, Bend offers a delightful slice of American history. However, sadly, beneath its picturesque exterior, it also hides a rather haunting story. It was on this day that all hell would break loose when a man, all dressed in black, took multiple shots at his own Ford F-250. What followed was a violent and chaotic scene in the nearby Safeway, which would end in multiple fatalities and injuries, and a nation reeling in anger. So it turns out that Ethan, who was the killer in question here, had a long and dark history, one with many glaring red flags. And although it is true that he would always keep himself out of trouble with the law, there were plenty of people around him who could quite visibly see he was, well, unstable to say the least. Now, hindsight always makes things more obvious, but Ethan's family and friends quite literally lost their opportunity. For now, he was dead, as was 2 other people. With multiple deaths and injuries, this was yet another horrible tragedy to hit America. And although Oregon's crime rate is typically 20% above the national average, well, even they weren't expecting this one. So, I know all of us are curious to know precisely what happened. But if I'm honest, the most interesting parts of this case are actually what happened before. And so, with that said, let's take a look at who Ethan Miller was and the chilling manifesto he left behind. Born on October 31st, 2001, Ethan Miller was an average kid who grew up in Bend. We don't know why, but he would grow up without a father consistently in the picture. And instead, he and his younger brother would grow up with his mother in an area just east of town. Ethan loved martial arts as a child, and would often go to evening classes to practice. He also enjoyed playing video games and looking at weapons, and red flag detected, was also obsessed with shootings such as the Columbine tragedy. Living in Bend, he had the choice from a handful of high schools. However, with his mother working at a specific Safeway found on the east of town, it made the most sense for him to attend Mountain View. But unfortunately, classmates do not remember Ethan so fondly. Several of them had reported that he would often get into trouble at school, picking on easy targets, and he always seemed to be upset about something. A lot of the information available does actually suggest that Ethan was a school bully, despite him often talking about how he apparently was the victim. In fact, it is reported that Ethan would try to fight quite literally everybody at Mountain View High School, according to some of his classmates at least. It is worrying to find yourself close to people who are capable of violence, and it does seem that those around him were quite understandably very uneasy with his company. Speaking of company, he didn't seem to like his own too much either, because as often is the case with bullies, he told those around him that he very much hated himself. However, he would also make it quite clear that he felt like he was always unfairly picked on. The women around him would find him to be very creepy too. He would incessantly message them even when they asked him not to, often to the point where it became harassment. Other classmates of Ethan would uniformly describe him as violent, aggressive, and the type of person who was most likely to become a school shooter. And although he mostly stayed out of trouble with the law and had no criminal record, that is not to say that he was friendly, cordial, or normal as a citizen. Important side note here, but Ethan's mother actually worked at the local Safeway, where she was then able to help him obtain a job as a part-time trolley pusher. The name is quite obvious. As it suggests, the role was to collect trolleys which were left behind in the parking lot. Now, I can imagine that this role probably did lean into his inferiority complex. It wasn't great, but it was honest work. Life was already quite difficult for Ethan. Aggressive bullying aside, he did not have the most stable of homes, or even minds for that matter. There are no public records to show that he suffered from any sort of depression or form of mental health issue. However, it could be argued that maybe that was the problem, because he simply ignored it and never sought treatment. And as we dive into the year 2020, when COVID began to sweep across America, things would only get worse for him. Moving forward, Ethan graduated from high school in June of 2020, which, as you can predict, was right when COVID was heating up. As you can imagine, this was a hugely disappointing time for any graduate across America. I mean, think about all those house parties, summer breaks, and celebrations that you normally have. Well, thanks to COVID, none of that was happening. I mean, let's be honest here, but Ethan likely was not going to be invited to any of those parties anyway, given his reputation. But either way, this was yet another step down to his already lonely lifestyle. The loneliness experienced during COVID honestly did suck for millions of us. But to add to Ethan's problems, he had also broken up with his girlfriend, and now had been, well, single for quite some time. And that didn't help. So, as you can see, Ethan had already been walking quite the fine line before COVID. But after 2020, things just seemed to spiral out of control for him. As we know, high school had already come to an end for Ethan, which meant that he no longer had any direct purpose. To add to that, the pandemic had also forced him inside, which meant that he could no longer enjoy MMA or at least practicing it with others. He no longer had a partner or any friends, and with the lockdown in place, his company, Safeway, also let him go. Ethan began to buckle, and his aggression would only get worse from there. Several things started to happen here. I mean, for one, his fascination for Columbine grew. But to add to that, he also became far more radicalized in almost every opinion he had. It was around this time that Ethan also began to see himself almost like a god, someone who was different and far superior to the rest of those around him. Moving forward, it was in July of 2022 that, under the name of WrathOfMan22, Ethan began to write his own 56-page manifesto, which he would then go on to document on a website called Wattpad. He called his manifesto The Downward Spiral of Ethan Miller, which was named after one of his favorite Nine Inch Nails albums called The Downward Spiral. Found within this journal, he would often say that he was obsessed with doomsday, that he could hardly contain it, and that he wanted to die. Now, here's a rather interesting side note, but despite his journal being read more than 400,000 times online, every single trace of it has since been wiped off the internet, and this includes archived pages, reposts, and the deletion of third-party videos. There does seem to be some very heavy efforts to try and quash his journal online, and I do kind of understand that. And so, with that in mind, I will only post what is already covered in public news reports. Found within his diary, Ethan described how his loneliness was one of the pivotal things that fueled his deep-seated anger. In one entry, he wrote, "Well then, I guess I should tell you all a little bit about myself, yeah? Not much that's noteworthy, and most of the stuff about my birth and early life is gonna be pretty easy to find. I've changed a lot since then, obviously, lol. The real changes started a little over 2 years ago, when COVID first started to become a global thing. I still can't believe that the entire world fell for that." The virus itself was real and deadly, but instead of actually coming up with a real solution to the problem, they used the problem to create mass hysteria and panic among us, and then forced us into isolation and loneliness for a significant amount of time. I still haven't been able to pull myself out of that state. Despite numerous attempts at getting back into MMA, despite numerous attempts at new jobs, despite numerous attempts at finding love once again, despite numerous attempts at being social and trying to make new friendships, they have all proved futile. So now we're here. I hope this journal can give you all a sense of peace and closure, but the world has made this happen. I am responsible for this, but I was turned into a monster. I created this tragedy, but society created me. Between the months of July and August of 2022, Ethan kept this manifesto mainly as a sounding board to express his hatred and anger. And believe me, there were some truly awful things in there. Now, before we continue, there is one very valid question that many people seem to be asking, and that is, why wasn't Ethan's journal spotted sooner? I think it's quite simple really, but it does appear that he'd set this journal to private and only made it public an hour before the attack. There's some pretty good evidence behind this too, because if you look at the view counts from some of the screenshots, there was only several hundred views on his profile. Around 90% of this journal is pure incoherent angry garbage, hating on friends, acquaintances, society, and family. In one of these entries, he talks about how his dysfunctional relationship with his mother and most of his classmates really messed him up. On this page, he wrote, "My family loves drama. They are always so damn dramatic over the smallest things. They would always find someone to blame and punish for accidents. Everyone else is right and I am wrong. My side of the story was always ignored. I still love them despite their flaws, but they definitely played a role in me becoming this way. This is the worst of all because it still hurts and fucks with me to this day. Any time I was to get in trouble, whether it be at school or not, my side of the story was always ignored. I was always honest when I got caught, but there were so many times where I would be defending myself from being harassed, and I'd get shit for it because the other kids were either a jock or some rich boy. My side would always be tossed aside as excuses and lying. What kind of logic is that? I still just don't get it, and I still feel the pain of that all the time. It really f***ed me up and made me even more antisocial by the time high school came around. It is quite interesting to see that, although Ethan was aware of his ever-worsening state, he simply had no desire to seek help in this desperate situation, and rather than fighting it, he relished in the volatility instead. You will see what I mean in just a few minutes, but in these journal entries, he would often reflect on his horrible thoughts and feelings with confidence instead of shame. This naturally showed an outstanding level of delusion from a man who would often call himself a king, god, and someone who was far more intelligent than the rest of society. To add to this, his fascination with the infamous Columbine disaster would only become stronger after 2020. He now seemed to idolize Eric and Dylan, often quoting them in his journals and posting videos of them to his social media. If that wasn't enough already, Ethan would also slowly begin to stockpile not only weapons but ammunition too, documenting how he would spend all of the money he made at Safeway to buy various shotguns, assault rifles, and modifications. And then came the videos, because in addition to making several illegal modifications to his firearms, which also included sawing off the end of his shotgun, which is a felony, he then started to attend multiple firing ranges and recorded himself while doing it. There definitely seemed to be a lot of effort in trying to replicate Dylan and Eric here. To slightly modernize it, he would also often play pumped up kicks in the background, while also adding a low quality grain filter over his videos to make them appear more vintage. Honestly, on their own, there was nothing special about these clips. Yes, they did create an ominous undertone, and there was a slight hint of cringe too. But when you tied these plans together with Ethan's growing isolation, his aggressive manifesto, and his dark fascinations, well, these were all red flags standing proud in plain sight. Red flags that many overlooked. And, sadly, Ethan had created his journal for something far more sinister too. We all know that journaling can be absolutely groundbreaking for your own mental health. However, this one was not merely just to log his feelings and his emotions. Oh no, it was a manifesto that he planned to leave behind in the aftermath of his own ferocious ideas. Once again, posting to Wattpad, Ethan said, "If you're reading this, then I am definitely dead, and I have just committed a national tragedy. I've left this journal for all the investigators, media, internet sleuths, etc. But most importantly, this is for the very few people that I actually care about and want to understand why and how this happened so that they can be at peace." What you'll see here is the documentation and description of the months, weeks, and days from today up until the massacre. Now, I wish I could say that Ethan was bluffing, but unfortunately, this was only the beginning. You see, he had basically decided that he no longer wanted to live life, but rather than go down quietly, he was going to become yet another pathetic Columbine copycat. The guns, the training, and the ranting were all for a cause here. If Ethan couldn't leave a positive impression on the world, he was going to scar it instead. We should probably talk about mental health here, because with Ethan, there were several key factors. For example, he was deeply misanthropic. To put it quite bluntly here, he deeply hated the human race. And this wasn't just your typical frustrations with society. He genuinely loathed everyone. I do think it is quite safe to say that he was likely severely depressed too. I mean, who wouldn't in those circumstances? And his aggression was likely a way to mask and hide it too. He may have been lonely for love, but he was also extraordinarily deluded too. I mean, Ethan literally believed that his partner, who he didn't know, was actually waiting for him in the afterlife. I'm not even kidding. I mean, not only was he a marginal incel, but he was giving serious Randy Stair vibes too. In this specific entry, he said, "Life has felt like such a chore to get through. I just want to be at peace with her, my soulmate. But she doesn't exist here. I have to cross over to the other side to finally meet her. I've always wanted love. That's all I've ever wanted in this life, and I'm just not going to find it here. I wasn't built for love here. If I was, I wouldn't be as antisocial as I am. But that's how I was wired to live here, as an antisocial robot who conforms to society. It's pathetic, really. On the other side, that won't be an issue. My spirit will be free and at peace with my true soulmate." Now that might sound crazy, but it's all I have. I've been so unlucky with love in this life, and I have no other choice but to pursue it in the afterlife. That's where it truly lies, not here. Now, although Ethan had very specific ideas for his attack, they wouldn't actually go to plan. You see, alongside his insufferable love for Eric and Dylan, he also hated his own school, Mountain View. So what do you think he was going to target? This is really insane to think about, because sure, hate the people that you used to go to school with, but if they graduated at the same time as you, then aren't you just murdering innocent children? But thankfully, Ethan, he was becoming so desperate and impatient with his rage that he could not wait 2 weeks for the school to reopen. And so, he changed his course instead. That, of course, being his local Safeway. The Safeway in question had great significance here, because not only was it the store that his mother used to work for, but he too used to be a trolley pusher there. In his final post on Wattpad, Ethan wrote, "Well, this is it. Today is the day I die. It's nerve-wracking as hell, but also peaceful in a way. Knowing that after my massacre, I'll be gone, truly at peace, far, far away from this place. I'm literally counting down the hours and minutes at this point. What's life without a little death and adrenaline? This is going to truly be epic. Why? I can already see all of you asking that question. And the answer is that I have no fucking idea. My head just doesn't fucking work anymore. It's like a living hell. I can never shut my thoughts off. Good thing that a 12 gauge can take care of that problem. Also, I'm full of rage. I'm just angry at the world and everything in it, and it's gonna be so nice to just watch it all burn. I hate society. Society sucks. It's useless, constraining, and ultimately unfair. This system is not one that I can win in, no matter what anyone says. After the fact, I know my place here, and I am not gonna stick around for it." I'm skipping past a few paragraphs here, but Ethan then continues to say, "My humanity is gone. I have no emotions whatsoever. I feel nothing. That's what's gonna make all of this so easy. I truly just wanna leave. I don't know where or when I lost it all, but I have. I have no hope for anything here. The only hope left is that death will bring me peace with her and a new life, 1,000,000 miles away in another universe. Life will never quite live up to the fantasies that I've created in my head. No one or nothing will be able to ever live up to the expectations in my head. Therefore, I cannot live up to anyone's expectations. Most of all, I really just hate myself. I'm a bloodthirsty, evil f***ing psychopath. To all of my family and friends, I loved all of you dearly. I was born to do this. So, with all of that said, I want you all to go live happy human lives. You guys are pure and you deserve it. Goodbye. At 7:03 p.m, the lens of a Ring doorbell camera captured Ethan as he stepped out of his Fox Hollow apartment. He moved forward with quiet purpose, an AR-15 style rifle slung over one shoulder and a 12-gauge shotgun in the other hand. A green satchel packed with ammunition rested against his side. Meanwhile, a tactical vest secured his chest. His black shirt bore a single word in dark red letters. Hurt, a reference to a Nine Inch Nails song. Ethan began his rampage in the parking lot, where he raised his weapon and fired 3 rounds into his own vehicle, that being his Ford F-250. The bullets punched through the metal and shattered glass panes, the gunshots alarming local residents. Surveillance cameras then captured him making his way through the lot between an Old Navy and a Costco, where he then opened fire. Firing at hot tubs and then a parked van, he then changed his aim to a passing black Honda Civic. The passenger side window suddenly exploded, sending shards of glass and shrapnel into the driver, wounding him. By 7:05 p.m, Ethan reached the Forum Shopping Centre, and as he approached, he took fire at the exterior of a Big Lots store. The surveillance camera showing shoppers inside taking cover from the gunfire. Ethan then walked past the surveillance camera and turned his attention towards the Safeway supermarket, the same store that he himself used to work at. We'll talk about what you should do in this situation later in this video, as I think it's a good thing to learn from a documentary like this. But with gunfire erupting outside, a surveillance camera in the Safeway store captures employees sounding the alarm before then trying to dial 911. And although they were successful in doing so, their decision to stand nearby almost cost them their lives. Stepping through the west entrance, Ethan spotted an 84-year-old man named Glenn Edward Bennett. Now, Glenn was actually a veteran who served in the Korean War. But now in his golden years, he wasn't quite aware of what was going on. That is when Ethan pulled the trigger 5 times on him, with the bullet striking Glenn's groin, right arm and left thigh, sending him to the floor. By now, panic had swept through the store, and 2 nearby shoppers had fled in terror. But Ethan decided to press deeper into the store instead, firing indiscriminately down the aisles. A surveillance camera captures what can only be described as anyone's worst nightmare. In the midst of their panic to run away from the gunfire, a shopper then trips up and accidentally falls to the floor. The noise was enough to capture Ethan's attention, who then decides to storm towards them with his rifle in his hand. The shopper, absolutely terrified, screams and begs for their life, and miraculously, he decided to spare them. Ethan paused, aimed and then fired at the floor right beside them, and then, without another glance, moved on. Now, we will never know why he spared their life. However, this behavior does lean into the god complex that we often see by shooters, where they feel powerful in deciding if someone lives or dies under their watch. But Ethan's next encounter would not be so lucky, because unknown to him at the time, somebody was waiting for him around the corner, and that was Daniel Ray Surratt Jr. Donald was a 66-year-old Safeway employee who had also served in the military. There are some bad aspects about his profile too, which we will get to later in the video, but the bottom line is that he was waiting for Ethan and was ready to take him down. Just as Ethan walked past, Donald then lunged towards him with a knife, his heroic efforts knocking the shotgun from Ethan's grasp. But sadly, although this would create a glimmer of hope in the fight, he would ultimately lose it, because soon after, Ethan was able to overpower Donald and then end his life with the rifle. Moments later, he then reached the produce aisle, and by now, police officers were actively storming the front of the store. Although Ethan had fantasized about fighting police officers, it seemed like he no longer wanted to, or maybe the fight had simply left him drained. Because moments later, he sat on the floor and then ended his life with the shotgun, with Ethan's rampage coming to an end at 7:08 p.m.
Following some breaking news, and the next couple of stories are just staggeringly tragic. The first one out of Bend, Oregon this morning. 3 people are dead following a shooting at a neighborhood grocery store. This happened again in Bend on Sunday evening. It's about 3 hours southeast of Portland. Witnesses described hearing dozens of gunshots this morning. The suspected shooter is among the dead. And Kelsey Kernstein is here with what we've learned overnight. Kelsey?
Well, Adrian, police say they found the gunman dead with an AR-15 style rifle as well as a shotgun near him. Now, police say it happened Sunday night. The unidentified shooter entered the parking lot of a shopping center and started firing. From there, investigators say the shooter walked into a Safeway grocery store, shooting one person near the entrance of the store. That victim later died at the hospital. Now, once inside the store, we're told the gunman walked around firing shots, killing a second person inside. As police arrived, they could still hear rounds of gunfire from inside the store, and eventually they were able to find the suspected shooter dead with the weapons nearby. But police say they did not hear any shots fired. They didn't have to shoot any shots, as well as they believe that the gunman acted alone.
The aftermath was enough to tell this horrible story. After identifying the gunman as Ethan Miller, law enforcement stormed his apartment, where they found more than 100 shell casings inside the complex, the shopping center, and several aisles of Safeway. Inside his truck, they discovered a sawn-off shotgun and 3 Molotov cocktails, all of which were unused but ready. During a conference which was hosted later that evening, police confirmed that Ethan had no criminal history in the area, and that, furthermore, Bend police had no evidence of prior threats made by him. As the hours ticked by, detectives realized that there was now a 56-page manifesto which was circulating online, which was also gaining a lot of attention. You know, I do find it quite interesting how this manifesto is now nowhere to be found. And this is despite it gaining almost 500,000 views before being nuked. The manifesto was enough for most people to believe that Ethan was in fact the shooter, and when forensic analysis confirmed this, it would gain only more attention. As usual, YouTube and Instagram were fairly quick in removing his posts and videos, but Wattpad, that would take some time. And with Ethan now dead, well, the community he had left behind was now faced with devastation and destruction that he had caused. One day later, a vigil was held in Drake Park for the 2 victims killed by Ethan, and hundreds of people gathered under the shade of tall pines to pay tribute. A choir sang gentle songs, local faith leaders offered words of hope, and mourners, some of whom narrowly escaped Sunday's attack, laid flowers at the foot of the amphitheatre. And at the heart of all of this was the loss of 2 lives. Born on September 8, 1937 in Gillette, Wyoming, Glenn Edward Bennett was 84 years old when he was mercilessly gunned down. An avid movie lover and a big fan of classic cars, Glenn was also a Korean War veteran. He often came into the store 2 or 3 times a day, and was a regular customer at Expressway Market and Deli in Bend. He liked his chicken, chocolate milk, and Pepsi. Born December 16, 1955, Donald Ray Surratt Jr. was a 66-year-old employee at Safeway, and was now also deemed to be a hero for his courageous efforts to stop Ethan, a decision that cost him his life, but likely saved the lives of others. It is worth noting here that Donald did have an honourable past, but also a shameful one. He served almost 3 decades in the military, but was also convicted of sexual crimes involving a minor in 1994. After returning to the military, he served as a combat engineer, and after retiring, he became an active member of the La Pine Seventh-day Adventist Church. A police spokeswoman would later say, while Donald's past may complicate how people feel about his legacy, his actions in the moment were courageous. 95 days after the attack, a censored version of the surveillance footage was then released to the public, which of course is what you've already seen. Given the nature of this video, I do feel it's kind of prudent to at least briefly touch on the topic of what to do in a supermarket shooting, and I believe that one of the main reasons why there were so little casualties in this story is precisely because how well people responded. Employees sounded the alarm and then contacted the authorities literally immediately after Ethan fired his first few shots towards the store. Now, obviously, the first thing that you should do as a customer is crouch down in a low profile and then look for a way out. Supermarkets can be absolutely huge, and all of them typically offer several ways out of the building, with thanks to several packing zones and multiple fire exits. It is also worth noting that customers and clients are likely to follow the lead of employees and managers during an active shooter situation, which is good because not only do they know the layout of the property, but they also have access to the back doors. The Department of Homeland Security also advises that you should only hide out if evacuation is not possible. Barricading doors and remaining quiet would be your best bet in this situation. And finally, if you can't run or hide, then the DHS suggests being as aggressive and disruptive as possible. Of course, I know these are just the basics and some of you will know this already, but other people will have no idea, which is why it's worth talking about. What I do find very interesting about this story is how Ethan actually planned to have a considerably higher number of victims, planning for around 40, which included officers. So with that in mind, I guess it's good news that he decided to change his plans to a store at 7 PM on a Sunday. It does make you wonder what would have happened if he continued with his plans and targeted Mountain View instead. With that in mind, I guess we can all be very glad that his plans changed so dramatically. If he was still alive, then Ethan would have certainly faced life imprisonment. It's devastating, really, the mess he made, all for nothing. Lonely incel vibes aside, I do think there needs to be more discussion on loneliness in adults, especially after COVID. But regardless, I'm still finding it so hard to understand the state of mind he was in. I mean, angry at society, sure, but wanting to kill others so you can meet your imaginary soulmate in the afterlife? Okay, well, if there is one, I'm sure the only thing he's kissing is the devil's ass. Thank you so much for watching today's video, folks. I really do appreciate you being here. And by the way, we've got a few changes coming up in next week's video, including the format. If you'd like to support the channel, then please consider subscribing to my Patreon here, or alternatively, find me on Instagram here. So, time to wrap this up. I'll see you again very soon for another video, folks, but until that moment arrives, remember to look after yourselves, look after each other, and as always, stay safe. Thank you, and goodbye.